Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our Smarter series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. It is high noon Central Time in Texas. I always feel that when we hit this mark, I should be ready for some sort of showdown at a corral or something like that. I'm still getting used to Texas life. Thank you very much to Texas for welcoming me and welcoming Smarter News. I think it's really important that we're based here in Texas. When I started Smarter News, there was that term that was floating around, in the lead up to the 2016 election and after that about flyover country, which I laugh about now because what is flyover country? Flyover country is actually the majority of the United States of America. There's a lot more states in between the coasts than just the two coasts. And I say this as someone born on a coast that spends most of her time on the coast, both east and west. And I think that really impacts our media perspective in America because so many media companies are only based in New York City or Washington, D.C., and that provides a certain perspective of the country. So I think it's really important that we're based here in Texas. And like I said, I'm very grateful for Texas for welcoming Smarter News as well. Thank you very much for that. We have a great debrief ready to go for you guys today. Did you ever read those Choose Your Own Adventure books when you were a kid? I love these. These were where you were able to get, through a chapter, and then you would have 2 or 3 different choices. And depending on what choice you made, then you would go on a different sort of plot line in the book. And you could have any number of different stories could emerge depending on your choices. And so I like to backtrack at times, make different choices and see how that affected the plot. It was a very interesting metaphor for life, except you often don't get to go in reverse. But what I love about our debriefs is that it's sort of like a choose your own adventure based on you. Whatever interests you is what I'd like to follow. I know there's a lot of different news stories out there, and clearly throughout the week, we do make some editorial choices about, hey, what are the top 3 things that you should know for today? But this is our moment where we're able to say, okay, what do you really want to hear about? And how can we best serve you on those topics? And what I look for is repetition really from you. What are the topics that come up quite a bit? And also sometimes, what are the topics that come up that I haven't seen at all in recent weeks? And is there news value there? And that actually happens to me today. So I'm going to kick it off with a story that has to do with what's going on overseas in a part of the world that we're not talking about at all, what the U.S. Navy is talking about. And the reason why it matters is that if we watch this particular area, there's always the potential for this conflict to grow bigger. So let me start with that. If you have any questions and you're joining us live, it's so great to have you. I'm going to be looking for your questions in just a little bit. Remember, there's also Instagram badges. For those of you not watching live, that's totally cool. But if you're watching live on Instagram, you're able to buy a badge and throw a tip into our tip jar, which is always nice, and I appreciate it. So this is a great, I wanted to, your Instagram names are also, I tend to look in, if you have kind of a funny name, I like to get your real name that you also list. But these were so good, I decided not to do that. So Indilana Jones, like Indiana Jones, but Indilana, just wrote me one thing saying, tell us more about Yemen. Have you heard about Yemen in the news at all? I certainly have. We've touched on it now and then. So what's going on in Yemen? Let me show you where it is in the world, because this will also explain why it matters. So Yemen is a very poor country. And you can see that it is really between 2 different waterways that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. Yemen is the site of a civil war that's been raging for years. It's also the site of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, one of the more dangerous arms of Al-Qaeda. So terrorism is an issue in Yemen that we've talked about in the past. But it is also the place of one of the worst humanitarian crises in the entire world. There's intense famine. And this is just an area that has been under constant pressure in the best, kind of a more general way to describe it, constant pressure. The civil war has major players that are involved in it. So you have what once was, or it was in the past, some sort of, I don't want to say traditional government that was backed by the United States and Saudi Arabia. And then you had a group called the Houthi rebels that are backed by Iran. And these, although the United States has sort of pulled back its efforts directly on the ground in Yemen or counterterrorism, in some ways have pulled that back because of the chaos that's happening there with the civil war. The civil war has continued. And the Houthi rebels, again, backed by Iran, have now in recent months really ramped up their attacks on a place like Saudi Arabia, which you don't necessarily see on the map if you're watching, but it's right next door. So this has been an area to watch because Saudi Arabia is saying, hey, this conflict is actually coming closer to home. And Saudi Arabia is certainly invested in making sure that this country doesn't fall to the Houthi rebels, because it would be like having a proxy of Iran right next door. And Saudi Arabia and Iran don't get along. But here's another reason why I want to show this to you. So if I didn't have your question, I would not have looked at Yemen, and I would not have realized that just over the last 24 hours, the US Navy announced something important. So I'm marking on this map two of these key waterways that are roughly around Yemen. One is the Red Sea. The Red Sea borders Egypt and Saudi Arabia. That's the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is the most important link between East and West. That's how it's described, but it allows boats to go through, from the Middle East right into the Mediterranean without having to go around the entire continent of Africa, which takes a lot of time. Time is money. You don't want to do that. So this is why, if you remember, there was a large cargo ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal over the last year. And that's why it was such a big deal, because it shut down traffic. And we know that something like 80% of all the products that are traded around the world have to go on a waterway of some sort. So hold that in mind. I want to take you to the other X, which is looking at the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is this really narrow waterway that gets right into this other key area, which is a lot of oil tankers come in and out right next to Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. So you have these two really critical waterways, smaller waterways, that really matter not only for national security, the movement of oil and goods around the world, but they're strategically important. And so here's what the US Navy said. The US Navy said that they have a new task force essentially that they've developed with allies to patrol the Red Sea. The Red Sea is what flows along Saudi Arabia and Yemen. You see Egypt and Sudan and into the Suez Canal, that very key canal that allows these large cargo ships to go very quickly from one part of the world to the next. Why are they doing that? Well, there's a concern about a ramp up of Houthi rebel activity and mines in the Red Sea, an attack on different ships there. And it is in the United States' interest to make sure that commerce flows, but also that the Red Sea remains safe. Because again, a very key waterway for most of the world. So this is just an area of the planet to keep in mind. Because while we're really focusing on Eastern Europe, and obviously for all the right reasons, we're continuing to watch what happens in Ukraine. Why we watch here is because we're always wondering, well, what could be the next big conflict in the Middle East? And Yemen, time and time again, comes up as, is this going to be the moment that this civil war that really was isolated to this very poor country suddenly becomes way bigger, where we're not just seeing the fighting in Yemen, but it spreads out to more dramatically into the waterways. It gets more into Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia feels more attacks, how do they respond? When the United States says these are our friends in the region and these are not our friends, how do we respond? And how does that affect not only security, but also the economy overall? So I think it's a really important story to keep an eye on, and one that can easily be ignored. Because think about this, and this is a key, we talked a little bit about it last week, but in Ukraine, you have images coming out of what's happening in Ukraine. You have people still doing live interviews on the ground in Ukraine. In Yemen, you have a population that is starving. You have a population that doesn't have access to clean water and electricity in many cases. And that impacts what we're able to see. It's also very dangerous. So there's not a lot of incentive for journalists to go there necessarily to cover a conflict that is more or less continued in its current fashion over the last several years. The thing that has changed recently is this escalation of brazen attacks by this Iranian-backed group. And so this is something to also watch as we're watching nuclear negotiations between the United States and Iran and other countries, because again, this area can sort of be used as a proxy area to make a statement about strength or influence in the region. So really important story. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Got another really important question. This one hasn't have nothing to do with foreign policy, but does have to do with how you travel and where you go around the world. And it was something I was going to mention to you guys. It was on my list because I knew April 18th was an important date. Do you know why? Well, April 18th was the date that we were going to find out, would the mask mandates be continued on public transportation in the United States? It's repeatedly been renewed over the last, several months. And we've seen some pressure recently on the administration about this from airline executives writing and saying, hey, this is an issue. Our team is having to deal with this every single day. This is very disruptive. Can we, do it? Everyone's doing away with the masks. What about this on public transportation? Then you had the state of Florida, along with 20 other states, sue the administration saying, yeah, this is outside of your purview. This is way too much. This is a power grab. And so that's, something. All this pressure, you kind of wonder, well, could we see this? This would be the last major mandate to get pulled back. And so Instagram handle, not so swank, which I identified with. So I wanted to just say out loud, not so swank, asked this question about masking in Philadelphia, which will connect. And I had another question from Care Bear about why we're still masking on planes. So I thought I would bring those two together because we're not only seeing a continuation. We got an announcement this week that the US government preemptively said, okay, we're not even going to wait to the 18th. We're just going to tell you right now, another 2 weeks at least of masking on public transportation, and then we'll see. And the city of Philadelphia announced that they're going to put back on mask mandates. Actually, on April 18th, I believe is the day that it would go back into effect. So what's going on here with COVID? And what about these mask mandates? And these situations are a little bit different because in one, we're talking about a federal policy that's affecting an industry, and the other, we're talking about a major city in America that is going back to this, which begs the question as to why. So what I thought would be helpful is just to take a look overall about what's happening when it comes to COVID-19 in America. And to do that, I like to go back to this data set that I've used since the beginning of the pandemic from the University of Washington. You've likely seen me use it before. It's let me see if I can do it. I've only said it a bazillion times. The Institute of Health and Metrics Evaluation. Just rolls off the tongue, guys. It's IHME. And it's a great data set that you're able to go and kind of do all these different pull down menus. It allows you to look at what's happening all over the world when it comes to different COVID cases and deaths and the like. So let me just to give you a full picture of what's happening in the United States, just so that we have some perspective. So we'll go here first because this is something you're going to hear about, which is there's a question about when the United States will cross that 1 million threshold of 1 million deaths from COVID-19. I do understand that there is debate about whether or not you died from COVID-19 or with COVID-19 and how that's sorted out depending on your state. But this is just one of the metrics that I've used, and you can see how that line has continued up. And really take a moment and think here for a moment, as we think back on the past about whether or not we would imagine that the new coronavirus that no one had ever seen before talked about in late 2019, early 2020 would then elicit this sort of news. So this is what this looks like as far as deaths. What I want to show you though, which is why do we look at deaths? We look at deaths because it talks to us about the severity of the illness, of the virus, of the disease. And I think this is actually really important. Daily deaths, you can actually see, well, what happened when COVID started in the United States? And you can see a huge drop, and then you can see different rises. I want you to pay close attention to what would be the most recent hill or rise in data sets. That was from Omicron. And you can see that we've come down since then. Omicron is very interesting when you take a look at this. I was surprised, and this is why you got to kind of step back and look at the data. Take a look at what Omicron looks like. This is daily infections and testing. For those of you who are listening later on our podcast or just can't be glued to what we're doing right now on Instagram, you can see just how serious the Omicron spike was in January. I mean, even compared to, and this sort of goes back to January 21, compared to the Delta variant. So you can just see how contagious, how many different infections and tests were surfacing because of Omicron. And so this is what I wanted to show you, because when you look at what the Philadelphia Health Department is saying, it is because of past experience that they decided they wanted to go back into mask mandates. So how big is the city of Philadelphia? I had to look it up today. 1.6 million people, thereabouts. So a very large city, right? How many cases of COVID did they have per day? 142 cases was a recent number. And the reason why that was concerning to the health department is that it was double what they had seen in the last week. So it was the pace of infections. It wasn't the number. It was just a sudden rise in cases. And there's a concern about the subvariant of Omicron, these different subvariants. The World Health Organization is looking at 2 others right now. Because we've seen it so contagious, because there was so much infection in the community back in January, what could make a difference here? And this is one of the things that the city is trying. In the comments, I know again, masking becomes a very much a political conversation. But one of the things I saw reading the comments coming from the health department was this question of, well, how do we, when we see that there's a rise, what is our best next move? What is our next best move? And we're going to be seeing this as we get more variants. We're going to be seeing there's going to be you're going to be hearing about this at least for the next year. So what do we do? Public health officials are saying to prevent a community from being affected. One of the things we haven't seen, and you could see for those past graphs that we were just looking at, is even with Omicron, we didn't see that huge spike in hospitalization and deaths like we've seen in over the last 2 years. And if you want to look for a silver lining with Omicron, it was that. So with wanting to keep hospitalizations down, with wanting to make sure that fewer people get very, very sick from this, what are the different health policies we could see? And what I'll be curious about is what happens in Philadelphia. So is it a mask mandate for a week? Could cities kind of go off and on with this? Or are they going to find out that it's not as effective as they thought, especially with Omicron, which seems to be so contagious that there's a question about, efficacy. Some doctors will obviously, and we've talked to them here at Smart News, will say, it's best to wear a mask. Others will say, best just to keep yourself ventilate, in a good ventilation. So this will be a really learning experience right now, I think is a critical part of the pandemic, because not only are we seeing that rise in the Northeast, but remember what we saw in the South in the summers. In June, you think everybody's outside, everybody's in air conditioning. You don't really associate that with a respiratory illness, but we have seen spikes in the South in the beginning of summer. And I'm going to be curious if we're going to see that same repeat, because then we're in a little bit different of a situation than a flu season, where we expect all the respiratory viruses to come and hang out, starting in October to March. And so this is another kind of curious part of the pandemic that I think is important to watch. So we'll see what happens with the city of Philadelphia. Right now, the planes they're going to have their masks on. You're going to have to fly with the mask on, at least for the next couple of weeks, and we'll see if anything changes that. But for right now, that's being maintained. And we'll see what's next. Okay, final quick story I want to mention to you, and then I'll go ahead and jump and take any of the questions that you guys have today. I was listening to the news this morning, and I was surprised to hear this. It was a great reminder. Do you remember last April? It's hard to remember yesterday, right? But last April was very early on in the President Biden administration, and he stepped to the microphone and he said, really our time in Afghanistan is over. We're really going to be moving to withdraw U.S. forces from there. And that was the beginning of what became one of the biggest news stories of the year. So what's happening in Afghanistan right now? We're talking about humanitarian crisis with Yemen. Well, there's obviously a huge concern about humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. But what we're really watching is with the Taliban in control, we've seen a couple things recently that have raised concerns. Obviously, the Taliban wants to be accepted by the global community as the rightful leader of Afghanistan, which would mean that they would be more welcomed into places like the United Nations, but also in negotiations. Listen, China's foreign minister has visited Afghanistan repeatedly. You have countries that are meeting with the Taliban just as they would any sort of organized government. But we are seeing that the Taliban are moving to crack down more on journalists. We're also seeing that the Taliban have restricted schools, so no schools for girls over the 6th grade. So 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, women are not going to school. Young girls are not going to school. And there's pressure coming from the international community on that. But the question becomes, how is this being used as part of a bartering chip for the Taliban? Could the Taliban say, hey, if you'd like to give us aid, because we don't have any functioning economy and we need to survive, we need to feed our people. If you like to give us aid, then perhaps we'll open up schools again for girls. It could be being used like that. And so this is a story to pay close attention to, because the international community will talk about outrage, about this. But the question becomes, what leverage do we have to actually change that reality? And we knew that the Taliban did not tolerate education for girls or freedom of the press, in the years that the Taliban ruled Afghanistan. So one of the questions has, of course, been, is this a new Taliban? Is this a reformed Taliban, or is it the same? And these are why these parts of the story matter to continue to follow. So that's something I just want to make sure that we don't forget that. We don't forget what's going on in Afghanistan. We don't forget what's happening in the Middle East, because these are the stories, and we're reminded of it with the New York City subway shooting. It just takes one incident to really change an entire news cycle. Obviously, it takes one incident to change someone's life. But terrorism isn't something that we've talked a lot about. The pandemic has impacted everybody. We haven't seen a lot of terrorist activity, that sort of hiding concern, or what we've seen in cities across America. I'm thinking about New York City. I'm thinking about San Bernardino, thinking about Fort Worth. We haven't necessarily talked about ISIS or Al Qaeda. Where do terrorist groups like to go? How do they like to gain strength? Chaos is really beneficial for them. A government that's not functioning well is good for them. Terrorist groups have an uncanny way of organization, social services. And you look at a place like Syria or Iraq, you can see terrorist groups have gone in and say, okay, well, you can't feed your family, you don't have health care. Well, we can help you with that. We can help you with that, but this is what it's going to take. Some sort of allegiance, or belief in our sort of ideology, or this sort of country that we're trying to create. And so when you see these areas of weakness, there's the opportunities for bad actors to come in. And those bad actors have already been proven to attack the United States of America or attack others that have led to larger global conflicts. And when we're thinking about our families and what can affect us, both just at home, our economy, but also our children as they grow up and they decide to either serve in the military or they want to pursue their dreams. International conflict obviously disrupts a lot of things. And so I always want to keep an eye on this. And I think it's something that can be very easily ignored in the news. So, does anyone have anything that they would like to talk about today before I jump off? I'd like to keep this quick and concise for you. And we're seeing this is a very important comment that Afghanistan has received billions and billions of dollars in aid. That is true. Afghanistan in general as a country has received billions of dollars in aid. There obviously was a cutoff in aid by the United States and others when the Taliban took control. The Taliban has never been listed as a foreign terrorist organization. That has been a matter of debate for decades. One of the reasons for it is that there has been the argument that the Taliban doesn't look to attack other countries. We're not talking about the Taliban attacks in Syria. We're not talking about Taliban-inspired attacks in America. We're talking about Al Qaeda or ISIS. And, there was a question about how close these groups are. If you've listened to some of our interviews with our national security analyst, Tom Jocelyn, he represents a group of thinking that there is no separation between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. They're actually the same, just slightly branded differently. And so he would argue that the Taliban deserve that designation. But that's one of the reasons why the United States has provided some aid, or others have rationalized some aid to try to test about whether or not, again, this is a different sort of quote unquote Taliban. I know saying that out loud sounds a little bit ridiculous, but we're waiting and seeing how the story is going to develop. Let's see. A couple questions from you about what's happening with China, and also what's happening with Elon Musk. So I'll finish up with those two. Those are really important. Really important and curious stories. So what's happening in Shanghai? A couple weeks ago, we talked about why Shanghai matters. Shanghai is a huge port city. It's one of the largest cities in China, if not the largest city in China. And we've seen a lockdown where people are literally not allowed to leave their homes, or they're having to go to these sort of pseudo camps where they're having to live until they test negative. Even if they test negative, sometimes they're not being released through really terrible conditions. And one of the reasons why we're curious about this is twofold: pandemic policy, right? Does this actually work? Because what we're seeing the Chinese government do is respond to positive tests of COVID-19 in Shanghai, but not necessarily symptomatic cases. So people are testing positive, but they're not necessarily symptomatic. But China has a zero tolerance policy when it comes to COVID, so they want to make sure it does not spread. And if you talk to researchers here in the United States or doctors, they'll say, Omicron, if it really gets loose in a place like China, would look very different than it did in the United States because of the densely packed cities and populations. It could. There was a question about what could it look like in a major city like Shanghai. We saw what it looked like in New York. A lot of people were tested positive, but luckily we did not see that spike in hospitalization and deaths. So we're watching it just for as far as pandemic policy, like, can you actually stop COVID? Is this really, I mean, is this a real reality? And number two, we're watching it because of politics. The Communist Party has such a stranglehold on the public and what they're able to do, what they're able to say, what they're able to read. But a public that gets rises against the government is always something to pay attention to. If discontent rises enough, could you actually see pressure on the communist government in China to change either policies or leadership? That's a big, big question, but it's one of the reasons why that story matters. And yes, the reality is that we're seeing these lockdowns continue, and now we're going to be going on to 3 weeks. So now it's getting longer. And now, you're past what would be kind of, well, everyone has done some sort of lockdown for 10 or 14 days, but now we're getting much longer than that. So I have asked, some of you have reached out saying that you have family in Shanghai. I'd love to talk to, if you have any contacts in Shanghai. And you have to be careful because the Chinese government does not want people talking about what's happening there. So we have to keep that in mind as well. So what's happening with Elon Musk? So Elon Musk is the wealthiest man on the planet. And as you know, he decided to take a stake in Twitter, large publicly traded company. He does that by buying a bunch of shares. And if you buy enough shares or buy enough of a company, then you tend to have leverage to dictate what happens in the company. But he's not quite there yet. So there's been a series of comments, and listen, this could change. So I'm just going to keep it very broad, where he said basically that he'd like to buy Twitter outright and take it private. So he's kind of, let's just say, he's kind of messing around with Twitter. Like, he's been very critical of Twitter. He doesn't feel that Twitter is a tool for freedom of speech. And he doesn't love the way that the company is being run. But he clearly loves Twitter because he's tweeting all the time. So he clearly likes the platform, but he's very critical of the platform. And so he could do it. I mean, he could, if he wanted to, he could sell all his shares and just be like, yeah, I'm done with it. He could buy more shares. He could try to buy the company. So we're watching big business in action. You don't normally get to see this in public. It's one of the reasons why there's a fascination. Like, what does the richest man in the world do with his money? Well, he goes around and tries to buy social media platforms. That's one of the ways that you could do it. And so you're seeing this play out in almost real time because he's on Twitter. And so even the company itself is being used as a message for one of its biggest critics. I don't use Twitter a lot. I love using Twitter as a newswire, sort of seeing what different news agencies are putting out there, what people are talking about. But the people that are most active tend to be, this is my observation, so it may be different for you, tend to be kind of this elite media political group that likes to talk to each other and get into arguments, which I'm happy to observe, but don't really have the time to take part in. And that's actually very helpful as a journalist. One of the things I found very helpful about Twitter, and I don't think they get enough credit for this, but if you want to know what President Zelensky is saying in Ukraine, he's going to put it on Twitter. You want to know what Elon Musk is talking? He's putting it on Twitter. You want to know what Russia's foreign minister is saying? It's on Twitter. And that's what I really value about it, is that you actually get to hear. I don't have to quote anybody. It's on Twitter. So I'm just going to quote them. And in that way, I really appreciate Twitter just being available for people. In the past, I would have had to go find press releases or listen to press conferences. And yes, these are the different images that big companies or politicians want to put out there, but they're direct quotes. And I think it's valuable. During the Trump presidency, obviously there was a lot of criticism of President Trump. And obviously there's a lot of criticism of how Twitter handled President Trump by pushing him off the platform. But in that presidency, because there was so much consternation over what President Trump was saying or not saying or what he was doing, it was really helpful to be able to quote him directly from Twitter. This White House uses Twitter a little bit differently. They do put a lot of live events on Twitter, which is very helpful. Obviously, the president himself is not tweeting as actively as former President Trump, but it's still helpful for me. I still find it very helpful. So I'll be curious what you guys think about that. So those are just a couple stories that I think are really important. I know some of you also have questions about what's going on with immigration. We're getting to this point, and I didn't check today, but if it's the 14th of April, I would expect us to be close to around the time where we'll have our monthly report about what happened at the U.S. southern border. And as we're getting into these summer months, these early summer months, particularly historically, you will see a rise of encounters at the U.S. southern border. There's a seasonality to it, or there has been in the past. And so this is when we tend to get our really big numbers. And that's going to be important because the government's year, this is very confusing. It's a fiscal year. So it's if you say the full year of immigration data, it actually starts in October and finishes in September. So it's not January to December. It's confusing. But this is how the government collects data. So we're already at such a high historic number. Whatever happens over the next several months is going to just confirm that, and will tell us a little something about what that policy, Title 42, really meant to what's happening at the U.S. southern border. Just briefly, Title 42, as you know, is a policy that enabled the U.S. government to quickly expel. Expel is not the word I should be using, because expel is more of a legal term. Well, actually, what I don't want to use is deported. I can use the term expel. So if someone came into the country illegally, it didn't look like they qualified for asylum, if they're not asylum seekers, then the U.S. government would really be able to process them very quickly and basically immediately expel them to Mexico. That's not usually the case. That's not usually the procedure. So we know that Title 42 will be ending, and what we're going to be watching is to see whether or not that motivates more people to try to come across the border with the expectation that there may be more opportunity for them to stay. And that's why we're going to be watching that. So, all right. If you haven't done so already, I'm going to put a couple of these links to these stories on our newsletter. Definitely something to check out if you haven't, because it's just one newsletter a week. I can't handle a bazillion newsletters. It's too much. So I'd hate to do that to you, but I like putting our content. If you want to catch up and just be off social media, we put all our content in our newsletter, but then we put conversation starters. So these are really great curated pieces that allow you to do a little reading on the weekend if you want to, without searching for it, without going on Twitter. We actually put it there for you, so it's very easy to access. I just want to make sure this is easy for you. So thank you so much again for all your support. Just the other day, I was running around the grocery store with my 2-year-old, and a woman kind of came out with her cart, and I thought, like, are we going to get in an accident? Like, what's going to happen here? In the middle of the day, I did my morning report. I got Smarter News off and running, and then all of a sudden I'm running around the grocery store with my kid. And she's like, I just want to tell you that I was having a conversation. This is Robin. Hi, Robin, if you're out there. I was having a conversation about news in the other aisle with my friend, and I was telling her about Smarter News, and then you walked by. And I was like, thank you. I appreciate that, because most of the time I'm just alone talking to the camera on my phone. So it's nice to know you guys are out there. I always appreciate when you say hello, and I'm always curious, how did you find Smarter News? What brought you to it? Just had another conversation this morning where someone was very skeptical about people wanting nonpartisan news. I'm like, no, they're actually out there. They're out there just ignoring them. They're really big. They're really fun. So anyways, I've had so many conversations like that over the last several years. So you'd think that it would change. And thank you very much. Kai said, blessed and holy Easter. Happy Easter, everybody, if you're celebrating this weekend. I know it's a big holiday, and it is for my family as well. So thank you so much for your support of Smarter News. We appreciate it as always. And questions and comments, let me know. And as always, more on smarternews.com. Have a great weekend, you guys. I'll see you back with more next week on Smarter News.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.